Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I talk to an author and screenwriter and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. My guest was born in London, Harrow in 1980 and has gone on to become one of the most prominent British voices on diversity and inclusion in the arts. My guest is the editor of the best-selling essay collection, The Good Immigrant, which won the Reader's Choice at the Books on My Bag Awards and was shortlisted for Book of the Year at the British Book Awards. Is the author of novels for both adults and young adults, including Coconut Unlimited, Meatspace, Run Riot, and The Boxer. His non-fiction writing includes his memoir on fatherhood, Brown Baby, and guide to writing called Your Story Matters. On today's Your Take, I'm joined by writer Nikesh Shukla about his early life, his writing career, and the themes that run through his stories. Good morning, nice to see you.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm very well, yeah, yourself?
Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. Being very Monday. This was recorded on a Monday.
Yeah, it's Tuesday today, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Yeah, that's
yeah.
how Monday I'm feeling. I still feel like it's Monday and it's Tuesday.
that Monday feeling. Nice to see you. Thank you kindly for taking time out of your day. It's nice because this is kind of a first for Your Take. We've interviewed around about 20 guests so far, but this is the first author we have on Your Take. So I'm interested to talk about your life, your career, the themes that run throughout your stories. But I thought to start with, we'd start off at the grassroots at the very beginning. Kind of wanted to talk about your early life as well as your upbringing. You were born in London in the suburb of Harrow in 1980. I wanted to firstly ask you just a little bit about your recollections of childhood and a little bit about your relationship with your parents or any siblings you had.
Yeah. God, I feel like my early life was so boring. It was so ordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. I just grew up, like I grew up in a multi-generational Gujarati household with lots of uncles and aunts and grandparents around me. I was sort of raised by community. So was my sister. Yeah, I just, my parents both worked a lot. My uncle and auntie both worked a lot. I shared a bedroom with my 16-year-old uncle when I was like between the ages of 3 and 6. Yeah, like none of it was out of the ordinary. It just was, like,
Yeah, sure.
it's really hard to romanticize it. Well, like it's definitely like nothing ever bad happened, but like it's also hard to sort of romanticize it because it was just such an ordinary day-to-day existence. I came from like a background of like 2 immigrant parents who came to the UK to earn money, to put down roots, and part of the project of that was just working really hard. Like they both just worked 7 days a week, and so we were just expected to get on with the business of studying hard enough to get jobs that would require them to retire early and not have to work 7 days a week.
You mentioned about your parents being hard workers, hard grafters with a strong work ethic. What was it they did for a living, your parents?
My dad was an accountant, and then he ran a small business for years and years where he would import gift wrapping paper from India and like sell it on to high street shops. and my mum worked at the Citizens Advice Bureau as an advisor, but with a specialism in, you know, being able to speak Hindi, Gujarati, Urdu, and a little bit of Punjabi.
I wanted to move on to your schooling, where you attended the Merchants Taylor School in Northwood in London. Just wanted to ask you if that was a happy experience for you. And in terms of your academia, was there any subjects you particularly enjoyed and excelled in?
Yeah, no, I never particularly liked that school. I never really felt comfortable there. It's something like my time there is sort of like a very fictionally retold in my first novel, Coconut Unlimited, which is sort of, you know, sort of very loosely based on my time there. But yeah, I just never really felt like I fit in. It was like, you know, there was a handful of brown kids. There were, you know, a lot of very overprivileged white kids, but like the brown kids who were all there, like none of us were from parents who had parents who had is a private schools, and none of our parents had the same amount of wealth or access or opportunity that our white peers did. Our parents were all working like 7 days a week to send us to the school, and you know, part of me at the time was like, why? Like, why work so hard? And you know, it's an interesting thing to kind of go, well, I had all of that privilege growing up, and it's very easy for me to go, boo-hoo, I never chose to go to private school, and like I wish I hadn't, and I wish my parents hadn't sent me. But the truth is I did go there, and it did probably like help me have the career I've had in ways that I sort of I'm still understanding. But it also, like, the fact that I got to go there means that you know, I've grown up with this sort of sense that, you know, any privilege I have is mine to share. And so that's why I do a lot of work that I do. Like I do a lot of youth work, I do a lot of mentoring work, because like, you know, I can't ever like, you know, it's what you do with that privilege that counts, I think, rather than denying that you had it in the first place.
I wanted to ask you where the love and discovery of writing and telling stories, how that came about. What kind of inspired you to write, and what kind of stories initially did you want to write about and share with your readers once your first novel was published?
Yeah, so I had classically I had a really good English teacher who made sure that all of the coursework that we were doing, all of the essays we were doing weren't like critical responses to things. He always tried to make things as creative as possible. A thing that I still remember that we were asked to do was, on reading The Catcher in the Rye when we were like 16, our coursework was to write a deleted dream sequence from the book, which I thought was just really, really amazing. Like, he also had us studying film scripts. You know, he was just a brilliant teacher. Like, he was funny and engaging, you know, liked Tarantino films and all the rest of it. And also, like, you know, I was a teenager during the golden age of hip hop, and I was just obsessed. I was obsessed with rap. I was obsessed with Tupac. I was obsessed with Ice Cube. I was obsessed with Nas. I was obsessed with all of these rappers who told brilliant stories through their rhymes. And, you know, between my English teacher encouraging us to think creatively and listening obsessively to rap, I started to write my own rap lyrics, and also, being an avid comic reader, write my own sort of Spider-Man fanfic, as it were. And, you know, those were my early days of like writing. Those were the first things that I was writing, was like bad rap lyrics and fan fiction Spider-Man.
With regard to the influences of writing, would you say that they were coming from, it kind of sounds like they were coming from different sources. You mentioned from music and from hip hop. you mentioned from like films, screenplays. But were there also kind of any novelists that kind
and comics as well.
And comics? Were there any kind of traditional novelists that kind of inspired you, or any books you read at an early age where you kind of thought, you know, I really want to pursue a writing career having read that particular novelist, or was it kind of just sources of inspiration from everywhere, really?
I didn't really read a lot of novels as a teenager. I remember reading The Buddha of Suburbia when I was 14, and it utterly changed my life. You know, I've told this story many times, but I was sitting at home with my parents watching TV, and an advert came on for the BBC Two adaptation of The Buddha of Suburbia, and you know, there was Naveen Andrews looking absolutely amazing. It was either 1994 or 96, I can't remember. He looked, you know, amazing, and it looked sexy, and it had that Bowie soundtrack, and it looked like there was a lot of banging in it and lots of like cool people taking drugs in it. And I was like, oh my god, I need to watch this. But you know, it was a one TV household in the mid 90s, and none of us knew how to. I think we had a video recorder that the timer didn't work on it, and I always didn't want my parents to know that I was going to be watching it. I think they would have forbidden me from watching it. But then it said based on the novel by Hanif Qureshi, and I thought, well, my mum never really stops. My mum doesn't really care what I read from the library. You know, well, she and I used to read a lot of like Star Wars and Star Trek novelizations. That was my thing, like lots of sci-fi. And then I got The Buddha of Suburbia out from the library, and I really remember reading those opening lines in the library. My name is Kareem Amir, and I'm an Englishman born and bred almost. And it was that one word, almost, that completely changed my life, because I just sort of, it just connected to me in a way that nothing had ever connected to me before. Like, I didn't read any books with brown kids who were confused about the environment that they were in, and both at home and at school before. Like, I'd never read anyone who looked like me, and I don't necessarily think people need to necessarily always engage with stuff featuring characters that look like them, but at pivotal times of your life where you're kind of making decisions about who you are, it really can make a difference. And that at that moment, The Buddha of Suburbia made a huge difference. And then I didn't really read novels until, well, I went to university in the East End. I went to university in Mile End, and I was still living in Harrow for the first 2 years, and it was quite a long train. And so I started reading novels just as a way of like getting through the train journey. And I read 2 novels. I read a book called Bombay Talkie by Amin Amir, and I read White Teeth by Zadie Smith, and both of them just really opened up the world to me. That, you know, they sung to me in the same way the Buddha of Suburbia had, and that was the first time I started considering that perhaps I had my own story to tell. And that was around the time I started writing my own novel. You know, very arrogant to start writing a novel when you've just started reading them again after your school. And, you know, I had this novel idea and I just couldn't make it work. There was this story in my family that I wanted to tell about how my uncle had become the first person in the country to ever bring a case of racial discrimination under the 1968 Race Relations Act. You know, I wanted to write like a John Grisham-esque interrogation of this court case, because my uncle had tried to buy a house, and the people selling the house refused to sell it to him because they didn't want to sell it to a person of color. And the Race Relations Act had just come in, and the purpose of the Race Relations Act was to kind of combat these everyday instances of racism. And so my uncle took him to court, and he didn't win. Well, the judge had to dismiss the case on the technicality, but he did say that had he tried the case, he would have found in favor of my uncle, and discrimination had definitely taken case. And they just really like sung to me that story, because it was the story of one person standing up for what they believed in, despite everyone around them telling them not to. And it just really inspired me. And I tried to write this novel about it when I was like 19 years old, and I just couldn't do it.
I want to come on to your first novel, which was published in 2010, and we've kind of briefly touched upon it already, Coconut Unlimited, which you say is autobiographical. As a first-time writer, how difficult was it to get your work read and published? What hurdles did you encounter? And what would your advice be to anyone looking to publish their first novel from your own personal experiences?
I mean, it took a while to find a publisher for that book. I had a lot of near misses, but I had a lot of people kind of just say to me that there wasn't a market for that type of book. You know, the market for books by Indian writers was quite small. I had one publisher telling me that they had already published an Indian writer that year, which I thought was weird. Like, there can only be one of us, and we only have one story to tell. I had another publisher tell me that my characters didn't feel authentically Asian enough. Well, a literary agent tell me my characters didn't feel authentically Asian enough, which was bonkers, given that I am authentically Asian. And it took a while, and you know, there was a lot of rejections based on things like the color of my skin and not the quality of the work. I sort of felt, after a while, I felt like, reject this book because of the quality of the writing, but if it's about me as a person, then that's something that feels wrong, right? And so yeah, it took a while to get published, and so like the lessons I've learned along the way are probably very specific to writers of color. But I mean, in terms of general things for writers out there trying to get published, the main thing to remember is, like, just take your time. People feel like they're in such a rush. Like, I meet writers in their 20s all the time, and 20s of days were like, if I don't get this novel published by the time I'm this age, then I feel like a failure. And I just think, well, actually, like, your writing gets better the more you do it, and the older you get, and the more time you spend with it. And so, like, don't be in such a rush to get the book. You know, when people are in a rush to get the book off their desk rather than think, I have done everything I can to this, that's when most writers fall down. And so I would just urge writers to take a step back, take some time off.
The first novel, Coconut Unlimited, set in the 1990s, and it deals with themes of class, growing up as an Asian in Harrow. It's about disapproving parents and forming a hip hop band. Is it solely autobiographical? Is it all based around your experiences of your younger years?
I'd say it's not very autobiographical. It's emotionally autobiographical, in that the feeling that the main character has throughout the novel is a feeling very familiar to me, because that's probably how I felt growing up. But in terms of like the surface detail, it's not very autobiographical. You know, there is a school that is similar to the school I went to, and there are characters similar to characters I grew up around, but like the action of the novel is pretty made up. You know, the actual band I had in those years, we didn't make it past writing lyrics on the back of our chemistry books. In the back of our chemistry books, we were called the Chemical Gangsters. So like, we never made it as far as the kids in that book do. But it's very emotionally true. It's very emotionally true about a lot of things. It's mostly emotionally true about like self-delusion and like thinking when you're a teenager that a thing has to happen now, otherwise your life is over. And actually those things end up going on to make, like, cement your identity and your sense of self when you're much older, which can be very comforting.
I wanted to talk about one of your other novels, which is Meatspace. An interesting concept, and I wanted to ask why you decided to write a novel that kind of makes a social comment on people's online personas being actually more interesting than their actual real lives. Where did that kind of idea come from? Is it kind of a social commentary on the use of social media, how it's dominated people's lives?
Yeah, I think it's much more about how we curate our personalities online and how that then manifests in how we live our lives. You know, there are people who we know in real life who follow us on social media streams. And so if you kind of bend the truth a little bit, that's something you're going to have to keep going in real life. I remember a friend of mine, or now an ex-friend of mine, sort of express it like, you know, my mum died the week my novel came out, and I'm made the decision to just promote my novel, because that sort of just felt like the easier choice at the time. And you know, a friend just sort of I remember a friend texted me, and they were like, "Oh, how are things? You know, you seem to be promoting your novel quite a lot." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm okay." And because they're my friend, I was like, "Oh yeah, my mum passed away a couple of weeks ago, so I'm feeling quite bad about it." And they were furious with me. They were like, "Well, how was I supposed to know that? You didn't tweet about it." And I just thought that was a really curious reaction, that like people were going to other people's social media for a true indication of what was going on in their lives. You know, we don't often put ourselves online. Years later, I did this youth project with a bunch of young people, and they pulled together this article which like posted up, like it had a picture from someone's Instagram grid and their caption that they wrote on their Instagram grid, and then they wrote a mini essay on how they were feeling the time they posted it. And it was a real insight into why people post stuff, or why they might like do things that self-aggrandizing or like bigging themselves up, and why those might come in moments of like crisis or vulnerability as ways of like as coping mechanisms. And I thought that was really, really fascinating. And so yeah, the book just became a lot about like curated personalities and how people struggle to be themselves online, and if they were their true selves online, then would we be that interested in them?
I'm interested to kind of hear your point on social media, because obviously as a creative and as a writer, obviously social media is a good tool to, as you say, to publicize your work, get your name out there and get people reading your content. But then it has kind of the reverse effect, which we've mentioned, the kind of topics that you talk about in the book. Do you think as people now, we've become too sort of dependent on social media? And would you like to see it almost, 20 years ago, these tools weren't available for us to go on Twitter, on Facebook? Would you almost like to see them come to an end in some ways?
Well, that feels a bit drastic. I think more like we probably just need to work out what our relationship with these things are, and figure out that your relationship with it is not the same as my relationship with it. I think especially as creatives, like there is this myth that in order for you to get a book deal, or in order for your work to do well, you have to have a big social media presence. Sure, that can help with some things, but it doesn't help with everything. Like this year I put out a book in February, and all of the bookshops were shut around that time, and so I didn't have the support network of the amazing booksellers and librarians out there who like really, really kindly, generously support my work. And so I got to see how much social media itself moved the dial in terms of book sales, and it was quite small. So like I think that's a big myth. And so I think there's also a danger that when you are a creative and you're told to be on social media to kind of build the brand of you so people can buy into the work, that can quite often take over, and it becomes the work rather than the work that you're meant to be doing. It can be quite a distraction from like writing or like making stuff, which is why you're doing this in the first place. No one sets out to go, well, I'm going to have 1 million Twitter followers and that's it. If you don't know why you're on those sites, then maybe that's the thing that you have to really think about. Like when I realized how little social media sold books and how much it demanded that I have an opinion about everything because of the type of platform I've ended up with, I just thought, I don't need to be on here as much. It's not going to help me sell books, and also I'm too stupid to have quick takes on everything. I want to go back to building my opinions and thoughts on things a lot slower, and using a wider range of sources rather than just what's coming at me through Twitter.
Sure. I wanted to move on and talk about the Good Immigrant project. I wanted to find out how that project came about and what the experience was like, editing and collaborating with other Black and Asian writers to produce 21 essays on race and racism within the UK.
Yeah. What's the question? Sorry.
Just how the project came about, and just a little
Oh
bit
yeah.
about your experience of editing and collaborating with other writers.
Yeah. So the project came about because I'd mentioned the times I'd had trying to get my first novel published, and finding it difficult because people were very happy to comment on the color of my skin and not the quality of the work, and I found that horrible. And I was finding that, you know, just because I'd been published, it didn't mean that like, suddenly there was a wealth of writers of color around. There was still a real lack, and and I didn't know why that was. And I was starting to realize that writers were still getting the same type of feedback that I'd been getting. And I thought, my God, if these writers are still having the same type of feedback that I got, then what has changed? So little has changed. And um, and so I just find myself on Twitter, like trying to make points about the lack of diversity in my industry and all the rest of it. And after a while, it just becomes like, it does, you realize again like how little Twitter moves the dial for stuff like that, because people are performatively angry in the moment, but then nothing changes. And so I thought, I need to do something that's not just me whining on Twitter. I need to do something that lasts. And like, it was partly a project to just go, my Twitter timeline about all of this stuff is often quite miserable, but here's a quite celebratory project. Why don't I just, instead of like, people at the time were going, well, we don't know where all the talent is. And I would think, well, then you are looking very hard. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just put together an anthology of amazing writers, and people will never be able to say, I don't know where the talent is ever again, because there'll be 21 of them right there. And so that was my impetus to do it. And then the editing process was really interesting, because like I hadn't realized until I edited an anthology myself how what being properly curatorial looks like. While I'd given these guys quite an open brief, it still had to hang together as a book, and a book that had my name like above everyone else's, because I'm the editor. And so while I'd given everyone an open brief and they turned in these essays, like as a writer, as a comedy writer, where my roots are, I knew that like I wanted people to push for comedy. It's a much funnier book than people might expect, because because I was the editor. If it had any other editor, it would have been completely different. And for me, the comedy kind of added to its sort of lingering mainstream appeal.
I wanted to pick up on a few things. Like during our discussion, you've mentioned about your early years and the difficulties in getting a book published, some of the prejudices you've come across within your life and during your working career. I kind of wanted to ask, as a writer, do you feel that when you're writing, you want to be almost a social commentator, political in a way? And are you writing to kind of bring about social change? Is that kind of your objective, or?
No, not at all. I'm just a writer. That's the thing. I'm a writer from a marginalized background. I can't not talk about these things. If you interviewed a white writer, would you ask them the same questions? Is the interesting thing to think about, because like the same expectations aren't made of those writers, but each of, like, in the same way that like all non-white artists, whatever field they're in, will be asked about whatever the most recent incident of racism was, or what diversity in their industry looks like. And actually, it's not us who are holding this back. It's the white writers who hold this space, and also they never get to talk about it. They're never asked about it. And I would much rather white artists, white writers, white creatives be asked about racism in our industry, because I'd be much more interested in what they have to say, because I know what I have to say, and I'm asked about it all the time, and I'm barely ever asked about the craft of writing. Whereas, like, Jonathan Franzen's got a book coming out at the moment, and he'll be asked hundreds of questions about craft and writing the great American novel, but no one's going to ask him his thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement or about border issues between America and Mexico and kids in cages and all the rest of it. Like the burden of writing about this stuff is also the burden of being constantly only asked about this stuff as well. And it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating thing where like it's sort of like panic, but like how panic buying petrol has been fueled by the media.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
like
totally. Yes.
talking, like being in media circles and people constantly asking you about race and immigration issues and racism, and added to your own lived experience of these things, you start to think this is an important thing. Well, it's an important thing, but like it's an important thing that I can't ever not write about because I'm constantly being asked about it. Therefore, I must continue to write about it. But like my dream is to write a Spider-Man comic and to disappear and for no one to ever ask me a question about race ever again because like I don't want to talk about it all the time. So like to go to your question more specifically, like I am a writer from a politicized background in a politicized time. It can't not infect the work, but you look at those first two books, they're comedy novels. Sure, they're making social points, but I think all good novels make some social point. They make some sort of thematic point. I guess the issue I have is just being asked about it all the time in interviews.
I think I totally agree with your comment. I think it's an interesting point you make. This generalization that if a black artist creates a particular song or writes a book, we ask them about, the themes in that particular song or whatever, and we go straight to, what are your opinions on race and racial prejudice, rather than asking somebody who's in maybe a privileged white middle class position, for example, which,
it would take the example of the England football team at the Euros this year, and the team as a team had decided to take the knee in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was really, really progressive. But it was the black players who were always asked about it. As the black players were all asked about it in the run up to Euros, white players weren't ever asked about it. And I love that it was an act of solidarity throughout the whole team, and that is really, really wonderful. But like when it's a thing that you're asked about, and then you decide that as you're going to do a statement as a team, and then you're told to shut up and just play sport because sport is politics free, like you can't win. And then like the three players who miss penalties and England doesn't win or draw in the Euro final are black, and then they get heaps and heaps of racist abuse, and you just think, well, this is why they were doing it, so like those footballers couldn't win. They were asked about all of these things when they just wanted to play football, but then being asked about them, they realize that because they're being asked about it, it's important that they speak. So they speak, and then they're told just to play football. And then when they play football and they make mistakes and don't score goals like everyone else, not everyone that has that day where you're firing all cylinders. They're just people. They miss penalties and then they suffer racism. So like, and then they're told it's because that they were speaking about it. That kind of created this heightened atmosphere. So it all just becomes like this house of cards that is like, we don't, I think when we talk about privilege, like, I think often privilege is about like not noticing the space you take up in any given situation. Like I will always notice my space, the space I take up as a brown person, but I don't really I don't think I, as often as I should, notice what space I take up as a man, which is privilege, you know.
Mm.
And so, yeah, sorry, like, I think it's an important thing to kind of to think about. You're asked about these things, so you speak about these things, and then you're told you shouldn't be talking about these things.
I wanted to talk about the most recent book that was published early this year, a memoir called Brown Baby.
Hmm.
Would you describe this as your most personal book that you've written so far? And can you tell us why these particular themes in the memoir are so important and close to your heart?
Yeah, it is the most personal thing I've written. You know, I've never really written nonfiction before, so like, it's my first major bit of nonfiction, and it's about me. It's about my deepest, darkest fears. Um, and I wanted, you know, the central question at the heart of the book is, how do we raise our kids to be joyful and boundless in a world that feels so bleak, that I feel so sad and angry about? And so when I was considering that question, I had to consider the things that I was feeling so sad and angry about, the things that I felt were bleak in the world, and, you know, making a list of things that were probably most pertinent to me personally. You know, I obviously don't talk about things that are necessary outside of my lived experience, because it's a memoir, you know. And I'm not an expert, so I can't necessarily write about things like disability, because it's just not my lived experience within that space. So um, the all of these things that I'm thinking about, and, you know, I do think that they are things, like, I've presented them in a way that hopefully makes people realize that they're things that we should all be thinking about. Like, we should all be talking to our kids about racism. We should all be talking to our kids about structural inequality. We should all be talking to our kids about climate collapse. We should all be talking to our kids about sexism and misogyny. In the same way that, like, you know, we should be thinking about the space that people who don't have a disability take up, and where that might affect people with disabilities, etc., etc. Um, so yeah, the book is basically a letter to my daughters about all of the stuff that all the things that keep me up at night, hopefully trying to make the world easier for them to navigate.
I wanted to pick up on what you just said, that the book's dedicated to your young daughters. How do you kind of wish for them to be? How do you wish for them to perceive your work? I've heard you say many times that you feel that your daughters will learn most about you through your kind of writing, and it's kind of like something that you're leaving to them about your experiences of growing up and
I don't think
so on. Okay.
I don't think I've ever said that. What I've said about this book is, people have asked me when will I think it's okay for my daughters to read this book, and what I've always said is, I don't imagine they'll need. Well, if I raise them in the way that I want to, I don't think they'll ever need to read this book, and most likely they'll probably cringe that it exists. Um, like, I use the example, like, an ex-girlfriend used to be a college roommate of the daughter of, like, a huge piece of American literature, and I remember meeting this college roommate and just going, "Oh my god, that's your dad! That's so amazing! That's so cool! Like, how does it feel? Or what's that like?" And she was like, "Oh, it's so embarrassing." And that's sort of how I feel like they'll be. But, like, I'm not even on that guy's level. Do you know what I mean? So um, I don't, I don't think they'll have to reckon with anything other than, there's a bunch of books that I wrote and they're all a bit cringy.
I was going to ask about your future plans with your writing. What other stories are you kind of looking to explore at the moment? And after writing a short film script, do you intend to kind of work in that area again?
Yeah, so I'm really enjoying writing for teenagers at the moment. I really like writing YA, so I've just written a new YA, which is with my editor. I'd like to write more for kids. My thing at the moment is, like, I've written about really horrific stuff. Like, I've written about racism. I've written about all of this stuff, and I'm ready to just write about joy. I want to write joyful things. I want to write things that push us to joy. I want to write like the literary Amelie. Do you know what I mean? Like something that makes you walk away, like the literary Hunt for the Wilder People, like the films that make you walk away with an absolute grin on your face because you've been on a journey, and that journey just fills your heart with joy and wonder and all the like summary goodness. So yeah, I'm working on stuff for teenagers at the moment, and I've got a book about creative writing coming out next year. And yeah, there are some film and TV things happening, but like I've been in development in the film and TV world for as long as I've been a novelist, but like just with very few things actually made or that I'm able or allowed to talk about because of various contracts and NDA. So like I'm hoping more stuff will happen shortly, but we'll just have to wait and see. It's one of those things where like I'm working on like 3 or 4 things, but if I told you any of them, you'd be like, wow, that sounds really exciting. And I'd be like, yeah, probably won't happen, but I'll kind of have to just give it my all in case it does. So it's really hard to talk about because like TV is just this weird world of like spinning a bunch of plates of projects that you really care about, because if it's the one that goes, you would give it 1,000,000,000% because you love it so much.
Sure.
But also you have to be prepared for the more likely outcome, which is sorry,
That it might not happen at all. Okay.
You obviously heartbreaking.
You mentioned earlier on in the interview that Tarantino was kind of like an influence, and you're into film as well. Have you ever wanted to write a feature film screenplay? Is that something you'd like to possibly do as a future goal?
He was an influence on my English teacher, and like I was definitely like a teenager when Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs were what teenage boys were watching. I have worked on a feature film. I just can't talk about it yet, sadly. But hopefully it'll be one of those ones I get to talk about because it's such a brilliant project.
I wanted to finish up with one final question, and then we kind of move on to the quick final questions just to kind of wrap up the interview.
Questions, they freak me out.
These won't freak you out, trust me. This is probably a question you've been asked so many times, and you'll probably say, not again, but I wanted to ask you because recently you were offered the MBE for your services to literature, which you decided to turn down. I just want to ask you, what made you decide to turn down the honour?
Read the article I wrote about it, I guess. But I don't think it's an honour if it's honouring the British Empire. I think there are other ways of honouring people for the stuff that they've done. And I just thought this year, when there are very, very complicated cultural conversations happening about the legacy of empire, and you've got the Conservative Party wanting us to never say anything ill of the empire or to focus on the good it did rather than the misery and bloodshed it caused. And you've got academics setting up like revisionist pro-empire groups at their universities, and you know we're living in a global pandemic where you just have to look at things like where the vaccine has been more prevalent than not, and where resources are in short supply and where they are in high supply. And like think about all of the sort of new age of colonialism stuff that people like Professor Kahindi Andrews is writing about, and Akala is writing about. And I just thought, I don't want to be a part of that club. And I kept being asked how to, because there's a movement to change the E in Empire to Excellence, Member of British Excellence, Order of British Excellence. And I think that sounds nice, but like, I don't think if we were to just do a swap out next year, Empire for Excellence, and not really talk about the legacy of Empire, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't want it to just sort of whitewash what needs to be a robust conversation that this country needs to have about empire and its legacy in the world today, now, because people are like, what about the Roman Empire? And you're like, come on, dude, don't be a child. What about the Ottoman Empire? Like, we're living in the after effects of the British Empire. There are people alive right now. Like, my dad lived in Kenya till 1966. Kenya got independence when, I may need correcting on this, but like, I feel like it was just after my dad left, or maybe even earlier. But either way, when my dad was born in Kenya, he was a subject of the British Empire. You know, my grandmother lived in Kenya and in India, like pre 1947 and post 1947. She's a subject of the British Empire. So like, I just didn't want to be a part of that.
We move on to the final questions. These are just quick questions just to end the interview. Question number one, I was going to ask, what is your favorite pastime?
Reading comics.
Moving on to film, what would you say is your favorite film and why?
Oh my God. This is why I hate quickfire things, because I can't help but overthink it. Because part of me is like, say something cool, but also like, why I feel so self-conscious about saying Star Wars. So it's like somewhere between Star Wars and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is my favorite film.
I'd struggle naming one film.
No
I'd
way.
have to choose
Yeah.
about 20.
No,
yeah.
I know what it is. I know what it is because it is a feel-good film that fills my heart with joy. Gross Point Blank. I love that film. I think it's
Gross Point Blank is an excellent film with John Cusack, the hit man who goes back to his high school reunion.
I freaked out, joined the army, went to business for myself. I'm a professional killer.
And it's got a great soundtrack.
Yeah.
Moving from film to novels, who would you say is your favorite novelist?
Zadie Smith.
If you could have chosen a different profession, what would it have been?
It's a dodge, but it's a profession I still do, but just voluntarily, and I'd happily go back to it in a second if no one wanted to pay for my writings anymore, but youth worker.
Who would you say in life's been your greatest inspiration?
James Baldwin.
Do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one?
What, like a physical newspaper?
Yeah, or read a newspaper online.
Yeah, I read The Guardian, although I'm increasingly don't want to read The Guardian anymore.
What's your favorite food?
Aloo parathas.
Who would you say is your favorite cultural icon?
Alive or dead?
Could be alive or dead.
James Baldwin.
Good choice. You can say it. I was going to ask you, what is your favorite curse word and why?
I can say it.
You can say it, yeah. Even though it's before the watershed.
I really like dickbag or dickhead. Is this like, because it's like, it is insulting, but it's also like, it's stupid enough to not be insulting as well.
Most people choose fuck, so it's
yeah. You can either use dickhead with venom or you can use it with love. I think it has range.
What would you say is your favorite place or holiday destination?
Oh, somewhere sunny beach where there's no one else. Deserted sunny beach.
Moving on to music, who would you say is your favorite music artist and what's your favorite album?
My God, what is my favorite album? Even though I haven't listened, oh no, I did listen to it this year. I feel like my favorite album is probably either Ruffy's Revenge by Asian Dub Foundation or OK Computer or Radiohead. In terms of favorite artist, I don't know, it changes so much. I currently love everything that a band called Salt do. S-A-U-L. No, S-A-U-L-T. Yeah. But historically, probably a rapper like Mos Def, aka Yasin Bey.
And then the final two questions. The first one, what is your greatest achievement to date?
Still being alive.
Lovely answer. And then the final one, how do you wish to be remembered?
I don't want people to forget me. Don't want to be remembered for anything. Actually, I want to be remembered for sending a lamb chop into space.
Go on, do it.
No, I did do it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and it went viral.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I feel like I'd want that over anything else.
Nikesh Shukla, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule and being a guest on Your Take and sharing your life story and your career with us. Lastly, how do we find out more about your work via your website and so on?
Just go into your nearest bookshop, whichever one it is, and just go, give me all the Shukla stuff and just buy it all.
That's a great answer. No, thanks for your time today. It's nice to see you. Also nice to have a fellow Bristol resident on the show. We've had a couple so far. So thanks for your time and I wish you all the very best for the future.
Cheers.